14 specialists, 3 years, 2 continents. Every one of them told her the same thing, which was that the conversation was over. Then a man with grease on his hands and a diagnostic question nobody had thought to ask yet looked at the problem the way he looked at every engine that came into his shop from the beginning without assuming the last mechanic was right, and everything changed. If you believe the right question changes everything, drop a heart and tell me your city. Stay. This is the whole story. Nashville in September had the particular quality of a city that had been hot for 4 months and was only now reluctantly beginning to negotiate with the idea of fall. The air still carried heat in it the way a cast iron pan carried heat, residually, stubbornly, long after the source had been removed. Dara Kimathi noticed it every morning when her aide, Petra, helped her into the van that would take her to the office she had run for 17 years, and which she had been running from a wheelchair for the past 2. The wheelchair was a T-Light Aero Z custom configured, which she had selected the same way she selected everything, by research, by specification, by rejecting the first 3 options on grounds that were precise and non-negotiable. She used it the way she used every tool that was genuinely necessary, without ceremony and without complaint and without allowing it to become the subject of any room she entered. She had been very clear about this. The wheelchair was not the subject. The company was the subject. The quarterly numbers were the subject. The logistics network she had built from a 3-truck regional carrier into a national infrastructure firm with 412 employees and contracts in 37 states was the subject. The wheelchair was how she got to the subject. This was a distinction she had been required to maintain with increasing force over the 2 years since the accident, because the accident had, without her permission, made the wheelchair the subject for a great many people. Her board, her investors. Her ex-husband, Garrett, who sat on her board as the firm's largest outside investor, and who had the specific quality of someone who expressed genuine concern in the exact language that also served his financial interests, which she found more exhausting than outright opposition would have been. Outright opposition she could address directly. Concern dressed as care required a different kind of energy, the kind that was expensive to sustain alongside running a company, and she was running out of the budget for it. The accident had been a highway collapse in Memphis, a ramp failure, structural, the kind that happened in the wrong second on the wrong morning with a car in exactly the wrong position. She had been in the back of a company vehicle on the way to a supplier meeting. The driver, a man named Carl who had been with the company for 11 years, had broken his collarbone. Dara had broken her T6 vertebra and a number of other things, the most consequential of which was the spinal cord itself, which had sustained the kind of incomplete injury that presented the nervous system with a calculation it was apparently not prepared to resolve quickly. T6 incomplete. She retained sensation and partial function below the injury in ways that were inconsistent, which was the medical language for a situation that did not behave the way anyone expected. She had been told this was promising. She had been told, by 14 specialists over 3 years, many variations of the word promising, and she had come to understand that promising was the word doctors used when they wanted to maintain a patient's engagement without committing to an outcome. She had stopped finding it useful. She had started in the 2nd year finding it actively counterproductive, because every promising that was followed by insufficient progress contributed to the board's narrative, and the board's narrative was that Dara Kimathi was running a $400 million logistics company from a position of diminished capacity, and that this situation required management. The management they had in mind was Garrett. She had divorced Garrett Kimathi 6 years earlier, which had been the correct decision and which she had executed with the same precision she brought to everything else, and which had left him with a substantial equity stake in the firm and a seat on the board that she had not been able to prevent because the terms of the divorce had been designed primarily around protecting the company rather than protecting herself from the company's board, which was a mistake she was now living inside. Garrett was not a bad person. She had been very clear about this in her own internal accounting because she needed the accounting to be accurate in order to navigate the situation correctly. He was a man who had loved her in the way that certain people loved extraordinary things, with a pride of proximity that was genuine, and that also, when the extraordinary thing was diminished, converted itself naturally into the management of the diminishment. He thought he was helping. He was also specifically and measurably using her injury narrative to build the case for the transition he had been suggesting, with increasing formality since month 8 of her recovery. She fired the 14th specialist in August. The dismissal had been professional and specific. She had cited 3 documented failures to follow agreed protocols and 1 instance of information shared with her board without her consent, which was the one she could prove and was sufficient. The specialist, a man named Dr. Harrow who came with a reputation that exceeded his actual utility, had been the latest in a sequence that she had maintained for 2 years with a rigor that most of her employees found either admirable or exhausting, depending on their proximity to it. She hired them. She briefed them with the precision of an executive onboarding a new department head. She set expectations that were specific and measurable. And when they failed to meet those expectations, or when she discovered that they were managing her rather than treating her, or when the information asymmetry between what they were telling her and what they were telling other people in her orbit exceeded what she could tolerate, she let them go. Petra, who had been with her since year one of the recovery and who was the only constant in the medical support ecosystem, had said to her once, in the flat, honest register she used when she had something true to say, "You keep firing the people who are supposed to help you." Dara had said, "I keep firing the people who are not helping me." Petra had said, "From the outside, those look the same." Dara had sat with that. She did not agree with it, but she sat with it, which was the most she could do. She was not someone who dismissed accurate observations, even when they were uncomfortable, and she was not certain Petra was wrong. She was certain that the current situation required a different approach. She did not yet know what the different approach was. The answer came from a mechanic's shop on Gallatin Road, which was not where she had expected it to come from, but which was also, in retrospect, exactly where it should have come from. Theo Bassett had owned the shop on Gallatin Road for 6 years, which was how long he had been in Nashville, having arrived from a smaller town in western Tennessee with a certified mechanic's license, a pickup truck that needed work, a 7-year-old who was then a 1-year-old, and the specific kind of forward momentum that belongs to people who have been through something that made the future feel more urgent than the past. The something was his wife Claire, who had died of ovarian cancer when Ren was 14 months old. A diagnosis that had come late and moved fast in the way that some diagnoses came late and moved fast, and which had ended a marriage that had been, by every measure he had, the best thing in his life up to that point. He had stayed in their hometown for 8 months afterward, which was the time it took him to understand that staying was not sustainable, and had moved to Nashville because a friend of his father's had a vacant bay in a shop on Gallatin Road that was available for reasonable rent and which he had turned, over 6 years of early mornings and late evenings, and the specific accumulation of word-of-mouth reputation that was the only advertising that worked in auto repair, into a business with 3 bays and 2 employees and enough work to require the kind of scheduling that would have been satisfying if he had the energy to find it satisfying, which on most days he did. Ren was 7 now. She had her mother's capacity for stillness, which was the quality Theo had loved most about Claire, the ability to be completely present in a moment without requiring the moment to produce anything. Ren was still in this way in classrooms and waiting rooms and anywhere else that other children were restless, and it was not compliance, not the performance of patience, but simply the way she was built. She had decided at some point in the previous year that she liked making paper cranes. She could not remember where she had learned to make them. Theo suspected a YouTube tutorial, because he had found her watching one on the iPad one morning, and by the afternoon she had made 11 cranes of varying quality and had arranged them on the kitchen table in what she described as a landing formation. She still made them. She kept a small stack of folded squares of paper in her jacket pocket, which was one of the things Theo checked before school drop-off, along with whether she had her lunch and whether her shoes were on the right feet, the shoe check being a legacy of the year she had been 5 and had refused to acknowledge the difference. The shop was on Gallatin Road across from a strip of storefronts that included a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, and a nail salon, and had on the end nearest the intersection a waiting room that Theo had furnished with second-hand chairs, a coffee maker that worked, and a basket of books and toys that he had assembled for the specific purpose of making the shop tolerable for parents who brought their cars in with children in tow. Because he had been on the other side of that waiting room in the early years and knew what it required. Dara Kimathi came to the shop on a Tuesday in September because the accessibility van that the company used for her transport had developed a noise in the rear suspension that Petra had reported to the fleet management contractor, who had scheduled a repair for the following week, and which Dara had overridden because she was not going to spend a week listening to a noise she could not identify in a vehicle she could not afford to have fail. She had asked Petra to find the nearest accessible shop. Petra had found Theo's. She arrived at 10:15 with Petra driving and the suspension doing the thing it was doing, which was a rhythmic knock that Theo heard before she was out of the van because he had, in 6 years of mechanical work, developed the specific involuntary attention to vehicle sounds that experienced mechanics developed, the way that doctors developed attention to the sounds of respiration in rooms where other people heard nothing. He came around from the side bay where he had been working and looked at the van and heard the knock and had a working hypothesis before he had formally been introduced to the problem. Petra introduced herself. She explained the noise. She said, "The fleet management service said it could wait a week." Theo said, "The fleet management service didn't hear it." He crouched beside the rear wheel well and listened to the idle and then stood and said, "I'll need to put it on the lift, probably an hour." He said it to Petra and then looked at the passenger side door, where Dara was completing the transfer into her chair with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times and was not interested in the attention the process usually attracted. She came around the back of the van. She looked at Theo with the expression she used for new situations, which was flat and direct and contained within it a very specific question. "Are you going to make this about something other than the work?" He had the impression in those first 4 seconds of someone who had been in a great many rooms recently where people had made things about something other than the work and who was done with that. He said, "There's a waiting room, coffee's fresh, it'll be an hour, maybe less." He said it to her, not to Petra, because she was the client and that was the correct person to address. She said, "Fine." She went inside. Ren was in the waiting room. She was in the corner chair with her paper crane supplies, making the careful, deliberate folds of a child who had elevated a skill to a form of meditation. And she looked up when Dara came in with the same quality of attention her father had, direct, registering what was there, not adjusting it. She said, "Hi." Dara said, "Hi." Ren said, "My dad makes really good coffee. It's in the blue pot." She returned to the crane. Dara looked at the blue pot. She looked at the waiting room, which had the particular quality of a space that someone had thought about rather than simply furnished. The books were arranged by size in a way that was accidental looking but wasn't. The light from the front window fell across the chairs in a way that made reading possible without strain, and the coffee pot was, as the child had said, producing a smell that was better than the setting warranted. Petra went to the corner for a call. Dara poured the coffee. She sat in the chair closest to the window, which was the position she always took in unfamiliar rooms because it gave her the best sight line, and she opened her laptop and worked. She worked for 35 minutes and then the mechanic came in and wiped his hands on a shop rag and said, "The rear sway bar end link is about to let go. The noise is consistent with the bushing failing on the passenger side." He said, "I can fix it now. It'll take another 40 minutes. She said, "What happens if it lets go?" He said, "At highway speed in normal conditions you'd feel it in the handling. In wet conditions or in a hard stop there's a real risk." He said, "You should not be on the highway with it as it is." She said, "Fix it." He nodded and turned to go. She said, "How did you know the passenger side specifically?" He turned back. He said, "Because the knock changes pitch slightly when you're turning left versus right. That's not symmetrical." Asymmetric noise in a sway bar is almost always the bushing closest to the loaded side of the vehicle. He said, "Your van loads heavier on the passenger side by about 40 pounds. I'd guess the rear chair anchor and transfer equipment." He said it as a diagnostic fact, not a question, and not with any of the particular sensitivity that people often applied to facts about her equipment, which was the quality of the observation she noticed. She said, "That's correct." He said, "Passenger side bushing has been taking more stress. It wore faster." He went back to the bay. She sat with her coffee and looked at the window and thought about the way he had said it, which was the way she said things when she was describing a system, from the observed behavior to the underlying cause, without editorializing, without the layer of management that most people applied to factual observations in her presence. Ren appeared at her elbow. She said, "This one's for you." She held out a paper crane. It was blue, folded from a square of blue paper, and it was better made than the ones in the stack behind her, which suggested she had taken more care with it. Dara looked at it. She said, "Why blue?" Ren said, "Blue is the best color for things that are supposed to go somewhere." She said it with the certainty of a child who had worked out a taxonomy and was confident of its accuracy. Dara said, "All right." She took the crane. She held it in her palm for a moment. She set it on the edge of the waiting room table beside her coffee. She did not think of it as a symbol. She thought of it as a crane made by a 7-year-old who had a clear theory of color. She went back to work. When Theo came in 40 minutes later to say the van was ready, the crane was still on the table. He looked at it and then at Dara. He said, "She gives them to people she likes." Dara said, "She doesn't know me." He said, "She doesn't usually need to." He said, "The van's ready. I replaced both rear end links, not just the failing one because the other side had about a month left in it. I'll add the parts cost but not the extra labor." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you came in for one problem and I found a second one. That's my job. I'm not going to charge you for doing my job correctly." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Most service providers would have billed the additional labor." He said most service providers didn't find the second problem. He held her gaze with the evenness of someone who had made his peace with the logic of his own choices and was not looking for approval of them. She said, "Fair." She said, "I'll come back." He said, "The van will be due for its next service in about 4 months. I'll put you in the system." She took the crane from the table. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not know yet what she was keeping it for. She knew she was keeping it. The drive back to the office from the first shop visit was 20 minutes, during which Petra said nothing and Dara said nothing, which was the arrangement that had made them functional together for 2 years. Petra was not a quiet person by nature. She had opinions and she expressed them when it was useful to express them. But she had learned early in her work with Dara that the most valuable thing she could do in the immediate aftermath of a difficult situation was give the aftermath room to breathe. The first shop visit had not been a difficult situation. It had been something else, something neither of them had a name for yet, and Petra drove in the specific silence of someone who was registering that the situation was different without knowing in which direction it was different, and Dara sat in the back with her laptop open and did not look at it for 14 of the 20 minutes. She was looking at the crane. She had not taken it out of her pocket yet. She had her hand in her pocket and the paper was between her fingers, and she was thinking about 11 words. Is the functional deficit symmetrical? She had been through enough technical assessments to understand immediately that it was a first principles question, a question that preceded the application of any framework, that asked for the raw data before the classified data, that treated the specific case as specific rather than as an instance of a general category. She had been in enough meetings with enough specialists to understand why nobody had asked it, which was not because they were incapable of asking it, but because the classification system they worked within organized information by category before it organized information by individual. And once you were T6 incomplete, you were in a category that had a well-established set of approaches. And the category-based approaches had been applied to her for 3 years with no particular attention to whether her case had characteristics that the category description was smoothing out. The diagnosis had been aggregate. The treatment had been aggregate. The results had been aggregate and unremarkable in the way that aggregate results tended to be when the specific thing that mattered was buried inside the average. She thought. He looked at the van. He looked at what the van was actually doing. He did not look at what vans of this type typically do. He looked at this one. It was a remarkably simple thing to have been missing for 3 years. She got to the office and had 4 meetings and 2 board calls, and a conversation with the firm's chief operating officer about a carrier contract in the Southeast that needed renegotiation. And she did all of these with her full attention, which was what she always did. And at the end of the afternoon, she called Park's office and left a message asking about the possibility of a new assessment that specifically mapped the functional presentation on each side individually before applying any aggregate classification. Park called back within the hour. When Dara described the question that had been asked, Park was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a correct clinical question. I'm embarrassed that it hasn't been asked explicitly." She said, "We're going to ask it." They scheduled the appointment. The Tuesdays accumulated the way Tuesdays accumulated when they were the best day of the week, which was quietly and with an increasing weight of association. Theo's day started at 6:15, which was when Ren's internal clock started her talking from across the hall, not loudly, not in distress, but in the specific ongoing narration of a child who had things to say and had been waiting since approximately 5 a.m. to say them. He had learned to hear the narration as a kind of weather system. If it was the school day narration, it had a particular quality, and if it was the weekend narration, it had another, and if she had been dreaming about something that required immediate discussion, it had a third. On most mornings, it was the school day narration, which he could respond to from across the hall for about 4 minutes before she appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, requiring the actual presence of the conversation. He got up. He made breakfast. He packed the lunch, which Ren supervised with an attention to nutritional detail that he found both impressive and slightly inconvenient on mornings when he did not have what the detail required. He got her to the bus. Then he went back to the shop and the day started for real, which meant the first bay was usually occupied by 8 and the phones started at 8:30, and by 9 the morning was fully in motion. The motion was, on most days, satisfying in the way that meaningful work was satisfying. There was a problem and he addressed it, and it was either solved or it was not. And if it was not, he had learned something about why not, which brought him closer to the solution. He had built the shop on that principle and the shop had survived on it. He had 2 employees. Gary, who was 27 and had the mechanical intuition of someone twice his age and the organizational habits of a very young dog, and Simone, who handled the front and the scheduling and the customer communication with the competence of someone who had been doing it since before Gary was born, and who looked at Theo on the Tuesday afternoons when Dara was in the waiting room with an expression of studied neutrality that communicated a great deal. He did not discuss it with Simone. He did not need to. Simone had worked with him for 4 years and had the specific knowledge of a person who had been watching someone go through grief and then go through the exit from grief, and she recognized the second phase without requiring him to narrate it. Dara was in the waiting room on Tuesdays and Simone made the coffee fresh before she arrived and did not comment on this and did not need to. At home in the evenings after Ren, Theo had taken to doing something he had not done in a while, which was to sit at the kitchen table with his own coffee and think about something other than the next day's schedule or the client list or the parts order. He was thinking about the project. He was thinking about the first principles diagnostic framework in the way he thought about mechanical problems. Not from the conclusion backward, but from the behavior forward, asking what it was doing and why it was doing it, and what the correct question was to ask before the correct answer could arrive. He was thinking about something that had started as a conversation about asymmetry in a waiting room chair and had become, over 10 weeks, something with a name and a clinical partner and a methodology document and a version of a future he had not been specifically imagining but which, when he looked at it directly, had the shape of something correct. He had told Lena about it on the phone and she had said, "Is the project the reason you look different?" He had said, "What do you mean different?" She had said, "You look the same for about 3 years, you look different lately." He had said, "The project is part of it." She had said, "And the rest?" He had said, "I'm working on the rest." She had said, "Good, work on it." She had not pressed further because Lena understood the precise amount of pressure a situation required and had never in his experience applied more than that. Dara worked late most nights. This was not new. She had been working late for 17 years, and the late nights were built into her calendar the way certain operational requirements were built into a logistics network, structurally rather than incidentally. What was new was what she worked on. The first question framework had become, from October onward, a genuine part of her working hours, which meant that the boardroom documents and the carrier contracts and the quarterly reviews that constituted the visible portion of her professional life were now sharing space with something that felt qualitatively different from the work she had been doing for 17 years. The difference was in what the work was for. The logistics company had been built on the principle of doing one thing better than anyone else and then growing the doing of it, which was a principle she believed in and which had produced genuine results. The first question was being built on the principle that something important was missing and could be made present, which was a different motivation and which produced a different quality of attention. She noticed the difference in herself. She noticed it the way she had been noticing things since September, not strategically, not toward any application, but as a factual change in the texture of her own thinking. She wrote about it in the notepad. She wrote, "The work feels like it belongs to something." She wrote, "The company always felt like it belonged to me." She thought about that distinction. She thought it was not a criticism of the company, which she had built correctly and which she was still running correctly. It was an observation about what changed when the work was connected to something prior to the work itself. When the question that motivated it was not how do I build a better version of this, but why does this need to exist and what is the life of the person it is for? The person it was for was specific. Not Dara Kimathi, the aggregate, but Dara Kimathi, T6 incomplete, right side, preserved pathway, 11 seconds. The person who had been in 14 conversations that had started from the wrong premise and who had been in one conversation that started from the right one. She thought about all the other people for whom that conversation had not yet happened and would not happen until someone built the mechanism for it, and she thought, that is the work. That is why. She wrote it down, she looked at it, she went back to the board documents. She was still Dara Kimathi, CEO. The board documents still required her full attention. Both were true. She was finding, for the first time in 2 years, that both could be true simultaneously without either diminishing the other. By the fourth Tuesday in October, she had established, without formally proposing it, a routine that involved arriving at the shop at 10:15 and working at the waiting room table until whatever Theo was finishing was done and then talking until she needed to leave for the afternoon block. The conversations had started with the van and with the asymmetry question and with the progress of the assessment with Park, and they had moved from there, over 4 Tuesdays, into territory that was harder to categorize than vehicle maintenance, but no less specific. She had told him about the company, not the board situation, not yet, but the operational architecture of it, which was the part that was genuinely interesting, and which she did not often have occasion to describe to someone who was listening, because the shape of it was interesting rather than because they had an agenda attached to it. He had asked questions that were good questions, which was to say they were questions that treated the company as a system with a logic she had built deliberately, rather than questions that treated it as a measure of her status or her ambition or her resilience. She found herself explaining things she had not explained in years because no one had asked, and the explaining produced the specific clarity that explaining to someone genuinely curious produced, which was different from the clarity of presenting to a board or briefing a department head. He had told her about the shop, about the 6 years and the 3 bays and the quality of problem he liked best, which was the problem that 2 other shops had already failed to solve, because those were the problems that required him to set aside everything the previous attempts had concluded and start from what the vehicle was actually doing. She had said, "You enjoy being the last resort." He had said, "I enjoy being the first correct attempt. Sometimes they're the same thing." She had looked at him. She had written nothing in her notebook. She had thought about that. By the 5th Tuesday, she had begun to understand something about the quality of his attention that she had been observing from the beginning without finding the language for it. He was not paying attention to her the way most people paid attention to her, which was with the slight orientation of someone responding to her status or her situation or the accumulated story that preceded her in every room. He was paying attention to what she was actually saying, which was a different thing, and which produced in her a corresponding willingness to say things she would not have said in other rooms, because the usual incentive for management, the need to control the version of herself that entered the room, was absent. She had not been told she was impressive. She had not been managed around. She had been given the specific hospitality of being in a room where she was simply herself, and found that after 2 years of the opposite, it was the most difficult and most necessary thing she had been offered. She had been in rooms where she was tolerated and rooms where she was celebrated and rooms where she was assessed and rooms where she was carefully managed around, and she had not been in a room in a long time where she was simply present and found that sufficient. The waiting room on Gallatin Road was that. She was beginning to understand what that meant, which was that sufficiency was not the same as limitation. It was the beginning of everything worth having. She did not say this to Theo. She noted it in the second yellow notepad she had begun keeping in October, not at the instruction of anyone, but as a practice she had started because it seemed like the correct way to document something she did not fully understand yet and did not want to lose track of. She wrote, "Not performing for the room." She wrote, "What does that feel like?" She wrote, "Look it up later." She did not look it up later. She kept writing in the notepad. By the sixth Tuesday, she had told him about Garrett, which she had not planned. The telling arrived naturally out of a conversation about board structures and governance provisions and what she would design differently with the benefit of hindsight, and she told him in the flat, honest language she used for things that were true and that she was no longer hiding. He had listened. He had said, "He's using the injury," not as a question, she said. "He believes he's protecting the company. He may also be using the injury. Both are true." He said, "Yes," she said. "I can't afford to be angry about it in a way that isn't useful." He said, "Are you angry?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." She looked at him. He said, "The anger means you know the difference between what's actually happening and what he's telling you is happening. If you weren't angry, you'd have accepted the narrative." She said, "I've never accepted the narrative." He said, "No, but the anger is the evidence of that. Don't lose it." She held this for a moment. She said, "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me about Garrett in 2 years." He said, "It's just accurate." She said, "Those are often the same thing." He went back to the bay. She went back to the laptop. Ren, in the corner, completed a crane and held it up and examined it with the expression of someone assessing quality control, and then set it in the small stack she was building and started a new one, and the morning continued in the specific warm quality of a Tuesday that was what Tuesdays had become. Garrett had called that same week. He had the quality of someone who tracked her medical calendar, which she found uncomfortable and which she could not entirely prevent because he remained a board member, and the board had, through a governance provision she had not adequately protected in the original incorporation, access to certain categories of executive health-related decision, making that she would have structured differently with the knowledge she now had. He called on a Thursday and said he had heard she was changing her specialist arrangement again and he wanted to understand what that meant for the succession planning conversation they had been deferring. She had said, "There is no succession planning conversation." He had said, "Dara," she had said, "there is no succession conversation. There is a new clinical approach with a new practitioner that has a sound methodological basis. That is the entirety of what is happening." He had said, "The board is going to want," she had said, "the board is going to want results which I have been delivering at every metric they have set, which I will continue to deliver and which will be materially improved by the time the 6-month review occurs." She had said it with the precision of someone who had been running this specific argument for 2 years and who was not longer willing to run it in its previous form. Garrett had said, "6 months." She had said, "6 months." And the call had ended, and she had sat with the silence for a moment, and then she had taken the crane out of her pocket and set it on her desk and looked at it while she collected herself, which was something she had begun doing in the weeks since the first shop visit, and which she had not told anyone about because there was nothing to tell. It was a paper crane a child had given her because the child thought she was going somewhere, and it seemed like the right color for going somewhere. She was working on going somewhere. The crane was keeping her company in the interim. The return visit happened in 2 weeks, not 4 months, which Theo registered without mentioning it. The van was technically fine. She came in on a Thursday morning and said there was a rattle in the front end she wanted checked, and he put it on the lift and found nothing structurally wrong, just a heat shield that had worked loose, which he secured in 12 minutes. She sat in the waiting room and worked. Ren was in school, Petra was outside on a call. He came in with the clipboard and said it was a loose heat shield, and she said, "What causes that?" He said, "Heat cycling, the metal expands and contracts. Over time the fasteners back out." He said, "It's not serious." She said, "I know it's not serious." She said, "I wanted to see how you explain things." A pause. He said, "You came back to observe my communication style." Said, "I came back because I wanted to understand something about the way you diagnose the sway bar." He sat down in the chair across from her, which she noted was the chair Ren used, and he looked at her with the particular attention that was, she had now established, his default mode present direct without the management layer. She said, "When you diagnosed the bushing, you described a process, observed behavior to underlying cause. You didn't start with the most likely cause and work toward fit. You started from the behavior itself." He said, "That's how diagnosis works." She said, "In mechanical systems." He said, "In most systems." She looked at him. She said, "I've had 14 specialists in 3 years. Every one of them started from a prior conclusion and worked toward confirmation. I kept firing them because the confirmation was always the same and the confirmation wasn't producing results." She said, "Your method is different." He said, "I'm a mechanic." She said, "You're someone who asks what the system is actually doing before deciding what's wrong with it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Nobody has done that." She said it plainly, without drama, as a factual statement about a situation. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Tell me what they start from." She told him. She told him the T6 classification and the incomplete designation and the 14 specialists, and the 3 years and the 14 promising assessments, and the 0 substantive changes to her functional status, and the specific ways in which each specialist had arrived at a preset conclusion, and organized the treatment around confirming it. She told him in the language she used for everything, which was precise and complete and contained no request for sympathy because she was not looking for sympathy. She was looking for the question nobody had thought to ask. He listened in the way she had now watched him listen twice, which was with full attention and no performed response. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said, I have a question. She said, ask. He said, is the functional deficit symmetrical? She was quiet. He said, you said incomplete injury. I know that means the damage is partial. What I don't know is whether the partial damage is the same on both sides. He said, because in a mechanical system, if the problem presents asymmetrically, the cause is almost never bilateral. One side is primary and the other side is compensating. She stared at him. She said, no one has ever asked that. He said, someone should have asked that on day one. She said, the imaging shows bilateral involvement at the injury site. He said, imaging shows structural damage. It doesn't always show what the structure is actually doing. He said, you said incomplete. Incomplete to what degree on each side? She said, I don't know, the assessments have always been aggregate. He said, that seems like a problem. She looked at him across the waiting room of a mechanic's shop on a Thursday morning in Nashville and said, you might be the most useful person I've spoken to in 2 years. He said, I'm a mechanic. She said, I know what you are. She said, I need to find a specialist who asks that question. He said, I can't help you there. I can change your oil though. She said, not why I came. He said, I know. He held her gaze with the steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him. She said, can I come back? He said, the shop is open Tuesday through Saturday. She said, not for the van. He looked at her. He said, I know that too. She picked up the blue crane from the table where she had, apparently without deciding to, placed it again. She put it in her pocket. She left. The question that nobody had asked was what she was taking with her, but she was also taking the crane, which mattered in a way she would not understand for a few more months. Theo thought about it the way he thought about most things that mattered, which was at the workbench in the bay after Ren was asleep. He had a habit of staying in the shop an extra hour on the evenings when something needed working out, not because the shop had anything to do with it, but because the particular smell of the place, the mineral oil and the cold metal and the winter air coming in under the bay door, was the environment in which his thinking moved most clearly. He had diagnosed the van's problem from the parking lot. He had diagnosed what was wrong with her diagnostic process from a waiting room chair in 40 minutes. He had not set out to do either of these things. He had simply been paying attention, which was the only mode he had ever operated in, and what he had paid attention to had told him what it was. He thought about the question he had asked her, and about the quality of silence it had produced, which was not the silence of offense or deflection, but the specific silence of someone who had just been asked a true question for the first time in a long conversation. He had seen that silence before, in the shop, when he asked a customer a question about their car that led directly to the actual problem rather than the problem they had been describing. The silence always had the same quality, a brief stillness followed by the expression of someone who understood suddenly that the conversation had just changed direction and that the new direction was the correct one. He had seen that quality in her face in the waiting room chair. He thought about that. He thought about the crane Ren had given her, which he had watched Ren select the paper for with the focused deliberation she applied to things she had decided mattered. He thought about the day Ren had given him the answer he needed for a design problem he had been working on for a week by asking a question he had not thought to ask. And he thought, the best diagnosticians are the ones who have not yet been taught that certain questions are too obvious to ask. He thought about Dara Kimathi and about the quality of attention she brought to a room, which was not the performance of attention, not the managed listening of someone who had been trained to perform engagement, but the actual thing, the receptive alertness of someone who was genuinely interested in what was in the room. He had met very few people in his adult life who brought that. Claire had. He thought about Claire on the evenings at the workbench in the way he always thought about her, without the complicated weight of unresolved grief but with the simple acknowledgement of absence, the way you acknowledged a space that a good thing had occupied. He thought she would have liked this woman. Not because of what Dara was professionally, Claire had not been particularly impressed by professional credentials, but because of the way she looked at things. Directly. Without the softening layer that most people applied to difficult realities. Claire had been that way. He thought it was a good quality, the kind you recognized in people partly because you had been trained to it yourself by someone who had it first. He finished the job he was working on. He turned off the bay lights. He went inside and checked on Ren, who was asleep with a half-finished crane on the nightstand. She made them before bed the way other children read, and he stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he had stood in that doorway 4,000 times, looking at the fact of her. He thought, some things you didn't go looking for. They came in on a Tuesday with a knock you could hear from across the parking lot, and you listened, and you learned what the knock was, and from there the rest of it unfolded in the natural direction that things unfolded when the right question had been asked. He went to bed. He slept well. In the morning he had the Subaru and the transmission problem and a Tuesday slot that was, he thought, probably going to be occupied, and that was fine. That was good, actually. That was what the Tuesday felt like now. The next phase of her medical search began with the question of asymmetry, which she brought to a specialist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center named Dr. Selina Park, who was not the 15th specialist in the same sequence but was instead a different kind of doctor, a neuromechanics researcher who worked at the intersection of structural neurology and movement science, and whose approach to SCI recovery was, her colleague's description had said, rigorously empirical. Dr. Park did not start from a prior conclusion. Dara recognized this in the first appointment because Park's first question, before she had seen any of the previous imaging, was, describe what you can and cannot do in as much specificity as possible, not what your injury is, what your body actually does. The assessment that followed confirmed what Theo had suspected by analogy. The functional deficit was not symmetrical. The left side of Dara's lower motor pathways had significantly less preserved function than the right, which had a degree of preserved pathway integrity that the aggregate assessments had been averaging out of the picture. The imaging had been read correctly in aggregate. Nobody had asked what the aggregate was composed of. Park said at the end of the second appointment that the right side presented pathway characteristics consistent with a recovery candidate for a neural stimulation and retraining protocol that had been showing results in incomplete SCI cases at the degree of preservation Dara presented on that side. She said, "This does not mean guaranteed recovery." She said, "It means the conversation is not over." Dara came into the next shop visit on a Tuesday in October and found Theo under the hood of a Ford F-150 and said to the back of his head, "The conversation is not over." He came out from under the hood. He looked at her. He said, "Tell me." She told him about Park and the asymmetry assessment and the neural stimulation protocol and the conversation that was not over. He listened and did not say, "I told you so," which would have been the incorrect response. "That's good," she said. "It's very early. The protocol is intensive. The outcomes are uncertain." He said, "Yes," she said. "I'm going to do it anyway." He said, "I know," she said. "How do you know?" He said, "Because you came here to tell me before you told anyone else who would need managing around it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's a precise observation." He said, "The van due for an oil change in 2 months." She said, "I'll come back before that." He said, "I know." He went back under the hood. She sat in the waiting room with Wren's crane in her pocket and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the specific sensation of a system that had been given the correct information and had begun working with it. Garrett's move came in November, which was later than she had expected and exactly when it made the most sense strategically. After the board's Q3 review, when the numbers were good but not exceptional, and when the recent personnel disruption from the specialist dismissals had given him a narrative thread he could pull. He requested a private meeting, which was his method. He never made his positions public before he had tested them in private, which was a quality she had once admired as discretion and now understood as tactics. He sat across from her in the small conference room she used for private meetings and said, with the tone he used for things he had decided before he said them, "I want to talk about transition planning." She said, "No," he said. "Dara," she said. "Garrett. Q3 numbers are in your briefing. The operational metrics are better than last year by every measure your equity position cares about. If you want to make a case for transition on the grounds of my performance, the case does not exist." He said, "I'm not making a case on performance." She said, "What are you making it on?" He said, "Sustainability, longevity. The reality that running this company at full capacity requires something that your current situation may not support indefinitely." She said, "My current situation." He held her gaze. He was not a coward. He said, "You've gone through 14 specialists. You're starting a new treatment protocol that your team doesn't fully understand. The board is watching and they're uncertain, and uncertainty at the board level has downstream effects that compound." She said, "I'm aware of how boards work. I built one." He said, "I know you did." He said, "I'm saying this because I still care about what happens to you." She said, "You're saying this because your equity stake is more valuable in a transition you control than in a transition you don't." She said it without malice. She said it as an accurate statement because accurate statements were the only kind she made. He was quiet. He said, "Both things can be true." She said, "Yes, they can." She said, "What I'm telling you is that the treatment protocol has a clinical basis that was not present in the previous 14 assessments, and that the board's uncertainty is going to resolve in the next 2 quarters in the direction of confidence. And that if you move on transition before that resolution, you will be wrong about the timing and you will be wrong about the situation." She said, "I need you to wait." He looked at her. She had not asked Garrett for anything in 6 years. The asking was calculated, and she knew he knew that, and she also knew he knew she was not wrong about the timing, because he was not a stupid man, and not wrong about the situation because the numbers were accurate. He said, "How long?" She said, 6 months. "Give the protocol 6 months." He said, "And if after 6 months," she said, "if after 6 months I cannot demonstrate functional progress that changes the board's assessment, I will have the transition conversation with you. On my terms, but I will have it." He looked at his hands. He said, 6 months. She said, 6 months. He stood. He said, "The board is going to ask." She said, "Let them ask, I'll answer." He left. She sat in the conference room alone for a moment, and then she took the crane out of her pocket and looked at it, which was not a thing she had ever done in her professional space and which she did not analyze. She simply looked at it. She thought blue is the best color for things that are supposed to go somewhere. She thought, she's right. She put it back in her pocket. She went back to work. Petra had been in the hallway outside the conference room when Garrett left. She had not been listening. She did not do that, but she had read the quality of the silence after the door closed, which told her something about how it had gone. She came in and set a glass of water on the table without comment. Dara said, "He agreed to 6 months." Petra said, "Good." She said, "Was it ugly?" Dara said, "It was honest." Petra looked at her. She said, those aren't usually the same thing with him. Dara said, he told me both things were true, that he cared about what happened to me and that his equity stake was a factor. Petra said, that is more honest than he's ever been. Dara said, yes. Petra sat down. She said, what do you need? Dara said, for December to work. Said, the protocol needs to be doing what Park thinks it's doing, and the board needs to see Q for the way I need them to see it. Petra said, I can manage the scheduling, 6 months is workable. She said, what else? Dara looked at the crane on the edge of the table. She had placed it there when Garrett arrived, which had been an unconscious act, and she noticed now that she had done it. Petra followed her gaze. She said nothing for a moment. She said, you've been going to that shop every Tuesday. Dara said, the van needs regular service. Petra said, the van is fine. She said it without inflection as a statement of fact, not an accusation. Dara said, I know. Petra said, he asked the right question. Dara said, yes. Petra said, and Dara said, and he doesn't manage me. He talks to me like I'm a person with a problem, not a problem in the shape of a person. Petra was quiet. Then she said, I've been trying to do that for 2 years. Dara looked at her. She said, you're better at it than anyone. She said, it's different. Petra said, I know. She said, different is not criticism. Dara said, I know you know that. Petra stood. She said, the December schedule is manageable. I'll protect the therapy slots. She went to the door. She turned back. She said, the crane is holding up well. She said it in the flat tone she used for observations that were not about what they appeared to be about. Dara said, Ren uses good paper. Petra said, good. She went out. Dara sat alone in the conference room with the water glass and the crane and the particular silence that followed a difficult conversation that had gone, against all probability, correctly. She thought about 6 months. She thought about what 6 months required from her, which was the protocol and the board and the numbers and the patience to not resolve the Garrett situation before it had enough information to be resolved correctly. She thought about a Tuesday in September when a man had heard a knock she could not identify and had known what to make of it before she was out of the van. She thought, some things you don't find by looking for them. You find them because you followed a noise that wouldn't stop. December was hard in the way that beginnings of difficult things were hard. Dr. Park's protocol involved electrical stimulation sessions 3 times a week and a home exercise component that required the kind of daily commitment that, added to the operational demands of running a $400 million company, created a mathematics of hours that Petra helped her navigate with the focused pragmatism that was Petra's particular gift. The stimulation sessions were not comfortable. Park had described them accurately. The sensation of waking up dormant pathways was the sensation of a system receiving signals it had not received in 2 years and did not immediately know what to do with. On the worst days, it manifested as a deep ache that was not precisely pain but occupied the same neighborhood. On the better days, it manifested as something she could only describe as information, the nervous system producing responses that she had not been able to produce in 26 months, responses that were inconsistent and not yet functional but were real, and that the EMG data confirmed were real, and that Park noted with the careful precision of someone who had been in this field long enough to know that real was the word that mattered before functional became possible. She told Theo about the sessions at the shop on a Tuesday in mid-December. She had been coming in on Tuesdays, which had become the working arrangement without either of them formally proposing it, because Tuesdays were the day she had a gap between a standing call and her afternoon block, and the shop was 10 minutes from the office, and Theo was always there on Tuesdays. She sat in the waiting room with coffee while Ren, who was on winter break, did the paper cranes in the corner, and she told him about the December sessions in the flat, honest language she used for everything. He listened. He said, how is the data? She said, better than baseline by every metric Park is tracking. He said, how do you feel about it? She said, I feel cautious. He said, why? She said, because I've been here before, promising the conversation isn't over. I've heard versions of this. He said, Park's methodology is different. She said, I know it's different. I'm telling you what the part of me that's been wrong before is saying. He said, yeah. He said, that part of you is right to say it. It's been right before. He said, it's also not the only part. She looked at him. He said, you came in the first time because you heard the knock and you needed it fixed. You didn't come back the second time because the van needed work. She said, no. He said, you came back because you wanted to see if the question was real. She said, yes. He said, it was real. She said, yes. He said, so. She looked at him across the waiting room with the December light coming through the front window at the low angle that December light took, and she felt the specific quality of being in a room with someone who was not managing her, not orienting toward her professional status or her injury status or her difficult reputation or the trailing narrative of 14 fired specialists, but simply sitting with the thing she had actually said and responding to it. She said, so I stay with it. He said, you stay with it. Ren said from the corner without looking up, blue is for things that are supposed to go somewhere. Theo looked at his daughter. He looked at Dara. He said, I have no idea how she does that. Dara said, she pays attention. He said, she really does. There was a quality to the afternoon that was the quality of things that had found their correct arrangement without anyone forcing the arrangement. And Dara sat in it and did not analyze it because analyzing it required a distance she did not currently have and did not particularly want. January brought the midpoint assessment with Park, and the midpoint assessment produced something she had not permitted herself to expect even though she had been accumulating the evidence of it for 6 weeks. She had been standing at the parallel bars for sessions since week 4. The standing was not clean, right side stronger, as the asymmetry assessment had predicted, the left side participating less consistently. But the right leg's weight-bearing capacity had increased in a way the EMG traced with the granular satisfaction of data that was doing what good data did, which was becoming more rather than less accurate as the assessment continued. Park said in the midpoint meeting, the right side is responding to the stimulation at a rate that's in the upper third of what this protocol has produced in comparable cases. She said, "What does that mean?" Park said, "It means the pathway integrity I identified in November is functional, not vestigial. The question is whether we can build on it." She said, "Can we?" Park said, "I believe so. I want to be careful about timelines and careful about what I'm promising." She said, "Don't promise anything, just tell me what the protocol requires." Park told her. Dara came to the shop the following Tuesday and told Theo. He was doing an oil change on a Subaru and she stood in the bay doorway, which she had started doing because waiting rooms were for waiting and she was not currently waiting, and she said, "The right side is responding." He slid out from under the car, he looked up at her, she said, "Park thinks the pathway integrity is functional." He said, "What does that mean practically?" She said, "It means the question was the right question." He said, "Yes," she said, "and the answer is not what 14 people said it was." He said, "I'm not a doctor." She said, "You are not." She said, "You asked the right question anyway." He sat up. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of an extended response, the expression he used when there was more to say but he was deciding how much of it to say. He said, "I've been thinking about something." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The way you described those 14 specialists, starting from the prior conclusion and working toward confirmation, that's not a medical problem, that's a systems problem." She said, "Yes." He said, "The systems problem is that there's no mechanism for asking what the actual behavior of the specific system is before applying a standard solution." She said, "Also yes." He said, "That's a gap." She said, "It's a very large gap." He said, "Does anyone address it?" She said, "Not systematically, there are individual practitioners who do it well, Park does it, but as a practice model, as a way of structuring the initial assessment and diagnostic phase, it doesn't exist formally." He said, "It should." She looked at him, she said, "It should." She said, "I've been thinking about that too." He said, "Tell me." She did. She had been turning it over since October, since the conversation about asymmetry and bilateral assumptions and the way aggregate data concealed specific information. She had been thinking about it the way she thought about logistics problems, as a system design question, which was, what would the correct architecture look like? She told him the shape of what she had been working toward, which was a pre-assessment protocol that focused exclusively on the specific functional presentation of the specific patient before any prior classification was applied, and that generated a behavioral profile that could be matched to treatment approaches rather than diagnosis categories. She said, "It's essentially a diagnostic triage layer that doesn't currently exist." He said, "It's what I do with cars." She said, "I know." He said, "You'd need someone who understood the medical side to build it out. I can barely describe the concept." She said, "I have someone who understands the medical side. Park's been thinking about this for years. She just hasn't had the framework or the funding." She said, "I have both." He said, "This is a company." She said, "It's a pilot." She said, "A pilot that could become a company." He said, "What would you need from me?" She said, "The diagnostic framework. The way you actually think about the problem, not the car version, the underlying logic. I need someone to articulate the first principles diagnostic approach in a way that Park and I can translate into clinical practice." He said, "I'm a mechanic." She said, "You're someone who asks what the system is actually doing. That's what I need." He was quiet for a long moment. The oil-change Subaru was sitting on the lift above him. He had 2 more jobs after it. He had ran on winter break until Thursday. He had the shop and the clients and the Tuesday routine. He said, "I need to understand what this looks like practically." She said, "It looks like conversations. You describe your diagnostic method. I translate it with Park into clinical language. We build a protocol." She said, "It's not a job, it's a collaboration." He said, "And what's in it for you?" She said, "Something that works." She said it plainly without the management layer, and he received it the same way. He said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Take your time." He went back under the Subaru. She went back to her morning. She thought about the question that had changed everything and about a man who had asked it without knowing it was the question, who had simply looked at the system the way he looked at every system, from the beginning, without assuming the previous diagnosis was correct. She thought, there is a version of this that is a company. She thought, there is also a version of this that is just a Tuesday, and both things are real. The crane was in her pocket. She had moved it to a dedicated pocket in her work coat so it would always be there, which was a thing she had done without analyzing and had not stopped doing. Park had become, over the months of the protocol, someone Dara trusted in the way she trusted people who had earned it specifically, not through credential or reputation, but through the specific evidence of their practice. Park asked the correct questions in the correct order. Park presented the data without the management layer, including the data that was not encouraging, which there was some of the left side was responding more slowly than the right, which had always been predicted by the asymmetry finding but which still required absorbing each time the numbers confirmed it. Park had said at the third session, "The asymmetry is not a failure of the protocol. The asymmetry is information," she had said. "The right side is responding because the pathway is there. The left side is slower because the pathway has more structural compromise." She said, "We treat them as separate problems, we don't average them." Dara had said, "That's the first question approach applied to the treatment itself." Park had said, "Yes," she said, "It's been how I've always thought about this. I've never had a patient who articulated it that way." Dara had said, "I learned it from a mechanic." Park had said, "I'd like to meet the mechanic." She had. The meeting happened in November, between the board confrontation and the December start of the intensive protocol phase. When Dara had brought Park to the shop on a Tuesday morning and introduced her to Theo with the specific economy of someone who understood that the meeting would go better if she stepped back from it and let the two of them find their own footing. It took 12 minutes. Park had asked Theo to describe his diagnostic process in his own words, and he had done it the way he did everything, precisely, from first principles, without the performance of someone demonstrating expertise. He had used a specific example, a car that had been diagnosed with a failing alternator by two shops, which he had diagnosed in 20 minutes as a failing accessory drive belt that was causing intermittent slip on the alternator, which was producing the inconsistent electrical output that the previous shops had attributed to the alternator itself. He had said, "The alternator was behaving abnormally. The previous diagnosis was, the alternator is faulty." The correct starting question was, what is causing the alternator to behave abnormally? Different question, different answer. Park had looked at Dara. She had said, "This is exactly what I want to build into the intake protocol." She had said, "The question is how to formalize it in clinical language." They had spent 2 hours at the waiting room table with Park's clinical notes and Theo's mechanics vocabulary and Dara's systems architecture background, and the particular productive friction of three people from different disciplines trying to translate the same underlying logic into a form that could be taught. Ren had come through at one point, assessed the assembled company, and left a crane on each notebook, green for Park's, orange for Theo's, blue for Dara's, and gone back to her corner. Park had looked at her crane. She had said, "Is the color significant?" Dara had said, "Yes." Park had said, "What does blue mean?" Dara had said, "Things that are supposed to go somewhere." Park had looked at the crane. She had said, "I'll take it." She had put it in her coat pocket. The protocol document they produced from those sessions over the next 3 months was not long. It fit on 4 pages, but it was specific in the way that good protocols were specific, which was that it described exactly what to do and why and left no ambiguity about the sequence of the questions. The sequence was, what is the system doing, not what should it be doing? Where is it doing it differently on one side versus the other? What does the asymmetry tell you about the location of the primary problem? Only then, what category does this case belong to if categories are still useful at all? It was a first principles diagnostic framework for SCI assessment. It had no precedent in the formal literature because no one had previously thought to write down what good clinicians did instinctively, which was to ask before they assumed. It was the kind of thing that seemed obvious once written, and that had not been written because the people who most needed to read it had already decided they knew what it said. The gap between what is obvious and what is practiced is, in medicine and in most other fields, where most of the damage accumulates quietly over time. The framework addressed that gap in 4 pages. Theo had read it once and said it was accurate. Park had read it and said it was publishable. Dara had read it and thought, 11 words in a waiting room chair, everything downstream of 11 words, it would have a precedent after they published it. Park had already been in contact with a journal. Dara was already thinking about funding. Theo had said when he read the 4-page document for the first time, "That's what I do when a car comes in." He had said it with the satisfaction of someone who had watched an intuition become a system, which was, Dara had told him, the moment when an idea was worth something. February was Ren's question. It came on a Tuesday, as most significant things now came on Tuesdays, because Tuesdays were the day Dara was at the shop and Ren was there because school had a half day, and Barbara, her grandmother, Theo's mother, who came down from Tennessee's western end twice a month, was not yet arrived. Ren was making cranes in the corner and Dara was at the small table with her laptop, which was the arrangement that had become unremarkable in the specific way things became unremarkable when they belonged, and Ren looked up from the crane she was folding and said, "Are you Dad's person?" It came out of nowhere and from everything. Theo was in the bay. Dara looked at Ren. She said, "What do you mean by your dad's person?" Ren said, "His person, the person that's on his side." She said, "He has Barbara and Gary and the guys at the shop, but that's different. That's like his team. I mean his person, the one that's just his." She said it with complete clarity, the clarity of a child who had identified a gap in the inventory and was asking whether it had been filled. Dara held this question in the air between them for a moment. She said, "I'm working on it." Ren considered this. She said, "Okay." She went back to the crane. She did not ask a follow-up question because the answer was sufficient, not yes but not no, which was a real answer, which was the kind of answer she apparently understood to be honest. Theo came in 15 minutes later with the clipboard and looked at the two of them at the table in the corner chair and said, "Everything all right," Dara said. "Ren asked me something." He said, "I heard it," she said. "From the bay," he said. "Acoustics in this shop are very poor." He sat down in the chair across from her. He said, "You don't have to answer it." She said, "I already answered it." He said, "I know." He said, "I heard that too." They looked at each other with the quality of two people who had arrived at the same place from different directions and were standing in it together, which was not complicated and also was not simple, which was what things were like when they were true. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said about the pilot." He said, "I've been thinking about it too." She said, "Park has agreed to be the clinical partner. The framework document you and I have been building, she thinks it's translatable." He said, "What are you calling it?" She said, "We haven't named it." He said, "Ren would name it if you asked." Dara looked at the corner where Ren was now holding up a completed crane, green this time, examining it in the window light with the satisfaction of a craftsperson assessing finished work. Dara said, "Ren." Ren looked over. She said, "We need a name for the project, the one your dad and I are building. It's a way of asking the right question first before you try to fix something." Ren looked at the crane. She said, "The first question." She said it the way she said the landing formation and the blue crane theory, with the tone of someone who had selected the correct word from a field of available words and was confident of the selection. Dara said, "The first question." She said it and heard it as a name. She looked at Theo. He said, "That's the name." She said, "That's the name." The pilot they built over the following months had a name and a clinical partner and a methodology that Theo had articulated in the specific plain language of someone who understood systems from the underside, and that Park had translated into clinical practice, and that Dara had turned into a fundable protocol with the precision she brought to every system she had ever built. The first question launched as a pilot at Vanderbilt in June with a small patient cohort and a specific hypothesis. That pre-classification behavioral assessment reduced treatment misalignment in incomplete SCI cases. And the preliminary data by August was doing the thing that data did when the question was right, which was becoming more precise rather than less. Theo's mother, his father's second wife, a woman named Lena who lived 2 hours west in Jackson and who came to Nashville once a month to be with Ren in the specific way of grandmothers who understood that grandparenting was a practice rather than a sentiment, was in Nashville the Tuesday after Ren asked the question. She was in the kitchen making dinner when Theo came in from the shop, and she looked at him with the expression she used when she had information she was deciding whether to offer. He said, "What?" She said, "Ren told me about the woman who comes on Tuesdays." He said, "She's a client." Lena said, "She's been coming for 2 months." He said, "The van needs regular service." Lena looked at him. He said, "She's a client who I'm also working on a project with, a professional project." Lena said, "That's not what Ren described." He said, "What did Ren describe?" Lena said, "She said she's the woman who has the right crane." He looked at this for a moment. Lena turned back to the stove. He said, "It's a paper crane she gave her. Blue paper." Lena said, "I know what it is." Ren explained the color system. She said, "Blue is for things that are supposed to go somewhere." He was quiet. Lena said, "Are you going somewhere?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "You know." He said, "I know." She said, "Good." She added something to the pot. She did not say anything else, which was her specific talent in these conversations, the ability to state the thing that needed stating and leave it standing without elaboration. He set the table. Ren came in from the other room and said, "Dad, can the Tuesday woman, can Dara come for dinner sometime?" She had started to use the name she had been using in her own head, which was apparently not the correct name but was the name of the category, which told him she had been thinking about it long enough to develop her own taxonomy for it. He said, "Maybe," she said. "That means yes, but he has to think about how to ask." She said it to Lena, who said, "That is correct." He said, "I'm standing right here." Ren said, "I know." She got her glass from the cabinet. He thought about asking. He thought about it for the rest of the dinner and for the drive to school in the morning and for the Tuesday after that, when Dara arrived at 10:15 with her laptop and the crane in her pocket and the specific economy of motion she brought to everything, and he said while she was settling in, "Ren wants to know if you'd come for dinner." She looked up from the laptop. He said, "Saturday if you're in town." She said, "I'm in town." She said, "Yes." He said, "She'll want to show you the crane inventory." She said, "How many does she have now?" He said, "I stopped counting at 112. She said, "I'll look at all of them." He went back to the bay. He was in the middle of a brake job on a Honda, and the job went well, and he thought about Saturday with a quality of anticipation that he recognized, which was the quality of looking forward to something that had nothing wrong with it, which was a quality he had not had consistent access to in 4 years, and which he recognized, cautiously trusting. The dinner was good in the specific way of evenings that were not trying to be anything other than what they were. Dara had brought wine because she had been a guest at enough dinners to know that you brought wine, and Ren had met her at the door and immediately taken her to see the crane inventory, which was organized on Ren's shelf in categories that Ren explained in detail. The going somewhere cranes, the staying put cranes, the cranes that were in between, and the ones that were for specific people, of which there were 6. The one she had given Dara was in a separate place. She said, "Yours is special because you came back for it." Dara said, "What do you mean?" Ren said, most people take them and you never see them again, you bring yours every Tuesday. Dara looked at the crane in her pocket. She had not known Ren had noticed. She thought, of course she noticed. She said, it seemed right to keep it close. Ren looked at her with the direct, registering attention that was precisely her father's. She said, yes. She said it with a finality that closed the subject and opened the dinner simultaneously. They ate pasta. Theo cooked the way he did everything without performance, producing something that was better than it needed to be simply because he had thought about what it required. And the conversation moved between Ren's current project, a list of every animal she intended to see in her lifetime, organized by continent, and the first question pilot and the way Nashville in December behaved differently from Nashville in September, which Dara said she had only been noticing since she started coming to this part of town regularly. Theo said, what do you notice? She said, the light is different, the mornings are different from downtown. She said, I've been working downtown for 17 years and I have not noticed anything like what I notice on the drive over here. He said, what do you notice? She said, Gallatin Road at 9 in the morning looks like a city that is actually being used. He looked at her. She said, downtown looks like it's being managed, this looks like it's being used. He said, yes. She said, that was the feeling in the kitchen the first night, the waiting room. He said, yes. Ren said, the waiting room is the best room, Dad put the books in on purpose. Theo said, I did. She said, he said good waiting rooms have books that are actually good, not books that were donated because they were too old to keep at home. Dara said, that's a correct principle. Theo said, thank you. They had coffee after and Ren went to bed with more negotiation than the previous Thursday had required, but less than a standard Saturday, and Dara and Theo sat at the kitchen table with the coffee and a silence that was warm in the specific way she had been writing about in the yellow notepad, warm because the room was used, not managed. She said, I need to tell you something. He said, tell me. She said, I don't know how to do this slowly. He said, you don't have to. She said, I've been moving at a specific pace professionally for 17 years. I assess, I decide, I act. I haven't operated at a different pace in a long time. He said, I know. She said, I'm telling you because I want to be honest about the gap between what I know and what I know how to do. He said, what do you know? She said, I know I want to be here. He said, that's the most important thing. She said, you're not surprised. He said, no. She said, you knew before I did. He said, I knew before you said it. I'm not sure I knew before you did. She looked at him. He said, the crane. He said, you keep the crane. She said, yes. He said, you've been going somewhere this whole time. She held his gaze. She said, yes. He said, good. He did not say anything else. He refilled the coffee. She stayed until 10:30, and when she left she had the crane in her pocket and a kind of knowledge she had not possessed in a long time, which was that the direction she was going was correct. Garrett reviewed the board materials in September. He said nothing about transition. He said, the Q3 numbers are strong. She said, yes. He said, the Vanderbilt pilot. He set the summary sheet down. He said, this is what the 6 months was for. She said, part of it. He said, the other part. She said, is not a board matter. He looked at her. He said, fair. He stood. He said, I was wrong about the timeline. She said, yes. He said, I was right that both things could be true. She said, you were right about that. You were wrong about which one should drive the decision. He said, yes. He left without elaborating which was the correct thing to do. She sat in the small conference room and looked at the crane on the edge of the table, where she placed it when she was in a meeting that required steadiness. And she thought about a 7-year-old who had folded it carefully out of blue paper and given it to a stranger because she thought the stranger might be going somewhere and blue was the best color for that. She thought about a question asked in a mechanic's waiting room that nobody had thought to ask in 14 specialist appointments. She thought about a Tuesday morning in September when a van pulled into a shop on Gallatin Road and a man came around from the side bay and heard the knock before he was formally introduced to the problem. She did not think this was lucky. She thought this was someone who looked at the system the way systems deserve to be looked at. That was not luck, that was a method. The standing came in October. It was not the first time she had stood in the protocol. She had been standing at the parallel bars since January, which was already a fact she had sat with for a long time, the way you sat with very large facts from a slight distance to get the full measure of them. The October standing was different because it happened without the bars. She was in a session with Park and the PT, a woman named Rosario who had the specific quality of a person who had seen enough improbable things to remain professionally measured about them. And Rosario said, today we try the 4-point again without the forearm support. And Dara had been in this conversation before, had known approximately what was coming, had prepared for it and not prepared for it in the way you prepared for things that had 2 possible outcomes, and she had stood. For 11 seconds on the first attempt, right side taking the primary load, left side participating in the way it had been learning to participate over 10 months of stimulus and response, and the accumulative logic of a nervous system that had been given the correct information and had been working with it. 11 seconds. Then she had sat and Rosario had written something down and Park had looked at her notebook and then at Dara, and the expression on Park's face was the expression of someone who had been careful with their hope for a long time and was briefly in that moment no longer able to be careful about it. Dara said, write it down. Park said, I'm writing it down. Dara said, don't make a thing of it. Rosario said, 11 seconds, that's on the record. She said it in the flat professional voice that meant she was absolutely making a thing of it quietly, correctly, in the way things ought to be made. Dara sat in the car afterward with Petra driving and did not move for a moment. She took the crane out of her pocket. She held it in her palm. She looked at it for a long time, then she called Theo. He answered on the second ring and she said, 11 seconds. And he said nothing for a moment and then he said, tell me, she told him. He was quiet in the way she had learned was his way of receiving things that mattered completely without rushing to response. He said, that's what the pathway was for. She said, yes. He said, how do you feel? She said, like someone gave me back something I was told was gone. He said, it wasn't gone. She said, no. She said, it needed the right question. He said, yes. She said, Theo. He said, yeah. She said, thank you. He said, you did the work. She said, you asked. He said, it was a reasonable question. She said, to you it was. She said, to everyone else it apparently wasn't. He said, then everyone else was approaching it wrong. He said it without drama as a plain factual observation, and it landed the way plain factual observations landed when they were true and when the person saying them was the person who had earned the right to say them. She went back to the office. She worked through the afternoon with the crane on the edge of her desk. She stayed late. She thought about the morning she had driven into the shop on Gallatin Road because a noise in the rear suspension had been too persistent to ignore, and a mechanic had heard it from across the parking lot and had a working hypothesis before they were introduced. She thought, some things announce themselves before you're ready for them. She thought, the correct response is to listen. The standing scene at Vanderbilt had a quality she had not expected, which was that it was quiet. She had imagined, in the months when she was allowing herself to imagine it, that it would be dramatic, that there would be a particular emotional quality to it, the release of something long compressed. What it actually was quiet. 11 seconds of weight distributed through bones and muscles that had been waiting for the distribution. With Rosario's hands hovering 2 inches from her elbows and Park writing in the EMG notebook and the fluorescent light of the therapy room doing what fluorescent light did, which was illuminate everything with the same clinical neutrality. She did not feel triumph. She felt accuracy. The sensation was the sensation of a system doing what it was actually built to do, which was not dramatic but was the entire point. She sat afterward and Rosario said, 11 seconds, and she said, I know, and Park wrote it down, and the room contained the 3 of them with the fact of it. On the drive back she did not cry, though she had thought she might. She held the crane and she looked out the window and she thought about the session 2 weeks from now and the one after that, which was what the standing was for, not the 11 seconds as an endpoint, but as the evidence that the endpoint was findable. She thought about the mechanic who had heard the knock before she was out of the van. She thought about the question that had preceded everything. She called him when she got home, not from the car, from her apartment, sitting on the couch with the crane on the cushion beside her. He answered in 2 rings. She told him. He listened. He said, that's what the pathway was for. She said, yes. She said, I keep thinking about how close I came to not going back to the shop the second time. The heat shield was loose. I knew it wasn't serious. I almost went to the fleet contractor. He was quiet for a moment. He said, but you didn't. She said, no. He said, why? She said, because I wanted to know if the diagnostic method was reproducible. He said, and she said, and I wanted to come back. He said, I know. She said, you knew before I did again. He said, you came in looking for something the first time. Most people who come in looking for something specific know what it is. You didn't know what it was yet. She said, but you did. He said, I had a hypothesis. She said, about the van or about the other thing? He said, both. She held the crane. She said, Theo. He said, yeah. She said, the 11 seconds is the beginning of something. He said, yes. She said, not just the standing. He said, I know. She said, are you going to keep making me say everything explicitly? He said, no, I'm confirming that I understand what you mean, which is good practice before you act on an assumption. She said, that's a reasonable diagnostic approach. He said, it's just how I work. She said, I know how you work. She said, I'm going to come to the shop on Tuesday and I'm going to sit in the waiting room and I'm going to work, and after that I'd like to have dinner. He said, I know. He said, 6 o'clock. I'll have Ren in bed by 8. She said, that's good planning. He said, I've been thinking about the logistics. She said, of course you have. She heard him smile, which she could now do. She had learned the shape of it from Tuesday mornings in the waiting room, the quality of his voice when something had pleased him. She said, Tuesday. He said, Tuesday. She put the phone down. She looked at the crane on the cushion. She thought, blue is for things that are supposed to go somewhere. She thought, I've been going somewhere since September. I just didn't know where until now. The board presentation in September had a specific quality that Dara recognized as the quality of being right in a room that had expected her to be wrong. Garrett was there, and the 2 other board members who had been in Garrett's orbit, and Park, who had agreed to present the clinical data directly, which was unusual for a board meeting and which had been Dara's decision and had been the correct one. Park presented for 20 minutes. She used data. She was precise. She described the asymmetry finding and the neural stimulation protocol and the preliminary outcomes from the Vanderbilt cohort, and the first question methodology document with the flat authority of someone who had been in clinical practice for 20 years and knew what the numbers meant and knew how to communicate what they meant to a room that was not clinical. When she finished, Garrett asked 3 questions. They were good questions, which was consistent with who he was. He was not a man who asked uninformed questions in professional rooms. Park answered all three with specificity and without managing the answers toward any particular conclusion, which was the quality of the presentation that Dara had known would matter. The board voted to maintain current leadership and extend the first question pilot funding, 4 votes to 1. The one was Garrett's. He did not make it dramatic. He voted and he sat and he looked at the numbers Park had presented and he said, "The methodology is sound." He said it to Dara, not the room. She said, "Yes," he said, "I should have asked better questions 6 months ago." She said, "Yes," he said, "I'll be more careful." She said, "I know you will." She said it without warmth and without harshness, which was the register she had landed on for her relationship with Garrett, which was the accurate register, not forgiving, not hostile, simply honest about what the relationship was and what it was capable of. He had done damage. He had also, in the final accounting, kept his word about the 6 months. Both were true. She was not going to resolve them into a single narrative because they did not resolve into one. She was going to work with both, which was what she had been learning since September. The Tuesday after the board meeting was unremarkable in the best sense. The van needed an oil change, which was a real oil change, and Theo did it in the same 40 minutes oil changes had always taken and brought the clipboard to the waiting room and said, "That's it, everything's good." She said, "Good." He said, "How did the board go?" She said, 4 to 1. He said, 4 in your favor. She said, "Yes." He said, "Who was the one?" She said, "Garrett." He said, "He held out to the end." She said, "He held out until Park presented the clinical data. Then he voted no and said the methodology was sound." He looked at her. She said, "Both things are true simultaneously, I've been told." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's harder than it sounds." He said, "Most accurate things are." He went back to the next job. Ren was at the table with her notebook. The First Question Project Volume 2, updating her tracking of the Vanderbilt cohort data, which Dara and Park had agreed to share with her in the simplified form that Ren had designed herself, which was a weekly column of numbers and a column of what the numbers meant and a column of what she thought about that. The what she thought column was, according to Park, the most accurate lay interpretation of the data she had read in her professional career. Dara had told Ren this. Ren had said, "I'm not lay, I'm just not a doctor yet." The yet was specific and non-negotiable, and Dara had written it in the notepad, "not yet." She had put it next to the sentence about performing for the room, which had also been Ren's contribution, though Ren had not known it. The notepad was full. She had started a second one in November. The second one had a different quality from the first, less inventory, more understanding, more of the sentences that were not about application but about what things were. She had told Theo about the notepads one Tuesday in December, not because he had asked but because the conversation had arrived at a place where it fit. He had said, "What do you write?" She had said, "What I notice, not what it means, just what it is." He had said, "That's the first question applied to your own life." She had said, "I hadn't thought of it that way." He had said, "What is the system doing, not what should it be doing?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Good practice." She had written that down in the second notepad that evening, "Good practice." She had written it alongside, "What is the system doing?" She had written, "The system is doing better." She had written, "The system is going somewhere." She had looked at that last sentence for a long time, the same way she had looked at the crane the first Tuesday in the waiting room without analysis, as a fact she was receiving rather than producing. Then she had closed the notepad and gone to bed and slept well, which was something she had not done consistently in 2 years and which was, she thought, its own kind of standing. There is a way to tell this story that is about recovery. 11 seconds of standing at a parallel bar. The neural pathway that everyone had written off because nobody had looked at which half of the data was which. The protocol that worked because it asked the first question before it applied the standard answer. That version is real and it happened and it matters. But it is not the most accurate account of what actually changed. What actually changed was a diagnostic practice. It changed in a waiting room in September when a man said, "Is the functional deficit symmetrical?" which was a question that cost him nothing to ask and that nobody in 14 specialist appointments had thought to ask because every one of them arrived with a framework they were confirming rather than a system they were reading. That is not a medical failure exclusively. It is a human one. The human failure of arriving at a problem with a conclusion already written and organizing the evidence around the conclusion rather than asking the problem what it is. Theo Bassett did not fail this way because he had no framework. He had frameworks, 32 distinct makes of vehicle with specific failure patterns, diagnostic logic built over 20 years of mechanical training and field experience. He had all of the same apparatus for premature conclusion that every other specialist had. What he had in addition was the specific discipline of asking what the system is actually doing before applying the known solution, which is not a discipline that requires genius. It requires the willingness to be wrong about what you already know, which is uncomfortable in a way that most people resolve by not asking. Dara had spent 3 years in the wrong version of the story. The wrong version was the one in which her body was the problem, and the specialists were the solution, and the solution kept not working because the problem was intractable. The right version was the one in which the assessment was the problem, and the question was the solution, and the solution had been available since the beginning to anyone who had looked at the specific system rather than the general category. She had found it in a shop on Gallatin Road on a Tuesday in September because she had heard a knock she couldn't identify and had gone to find someone who could tell her what it was. The man who told her what it was looked at everything the same way, from the behavior of the system to the underlying cause, without the shortcut of prior assumption. He had done it for her van, and then he had done it for her when she had asked him to, and the question he had asked had been the first right question in 2 years, and it had changed everything downstream of it. Ren had given her a blue crane on the day they met because blue was for things that were supposed to go somewhere. She was 7. She had correct information. The crane was still in Dara's pocket in October when she stood for 11 seconds. It was still in her pocket at Thanksgiving when she stood for 45. It was still there at Christmas when she stood for longer than she counted because she had stopped counting and started simply standing, which was a different kind of fact. A Tuesday in March, the shop on Gallatin Road, the coffee in the blue pot. Ren at the table with the notebook now labeled First Question Project, Volume 2, filling in data from the Vanderbilt pilot in the careful handwriting of a child who understood that some things were worth keeping track of. Theo at the side bay, visible through the bay door, working on a transmission that had been sent to 2 other shops and returned unresolved, which was the kind of problem he liked best. Dara at the waiting room table with her laptop, and the crane on the table's edge, and the particular quality of a morning that was not exceptional and was not supposed to be exceptional. That was simply what Tuesdays had become, which was the right day of the week in the right room in the right ongoing story. She looked at the drawing Ren had made in November and taped to the wall of the waiting room, which was a map of the diagnostic process they had been describing together. The First Question Project rendered in Ren's taxonomy, with boxes for the question and boxes for the behavior and arrows between them in the blue she used for things that were going somewhere. She looked at it the way she looked at it every Tuesday, which was without the analysis she applied to most things, as a simple fact of the room she was in. She thought about a woman who had fired 14 specialists and hired none of them correctly because she had been asking the wrong people to ask a question that she had not known was the right question. She thought about a man who had asked it in 12 words over a van on a lift and had not thought of it as remarkable because to him it was simply how you started. That was the thing in the end. Not the miracle of recovery, which was real and hard-earned and had a year of difficult sessions inside it. Not the project, which was a company in the making and would be its own story. The thing was simpler than both of those. It was the question. It is almost always the question. The right question is the one that is asked before the conclusion, the one that starts from what the system is actually doing rather than what you already know it should be doing. It is available to anyone willing to ask it. Most people don't, not because they are incapable. Because they have arrived at the conversation with the answer already in their hands, and a question would require putting the answer down first. Theo Bassett put the answer down. He had been doing it his whole professional life. He had not thought of it as anything other than how you did the work correctly. He was right about that. It is how you do it correctly. The answer that comes first is almost always wrong. The question that comes first is almost always right. Stay with the question. The system will tell you what it's doing. You just have to be willing to listen before you decide. The door of the shop on Gallatin Road, the coffee in the blue pot, the crane made with care out of blue paper by a 7-year-old who had a correct theory of color, the question asked by a man who had no reason to ask it except that it was accurate and accuracy was his habit. 11 seconds, then more, then the board meeting, then the notepad's second volume. Then Tuesday and the next Tuesday and the one after that. The system doing what it was built to do given the right question at the right time. That is the whole story. It is also just the beginning.